Hey, y'all. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Peace Podcast. This is season 2, episode 34. Just give me boundaries with myself, whatever that looks like. And so you hear a lot on social media and YouTube and the like about how setting boundaries are a healthy way to remain in relationship with other people. And while that is true, oftentimes I think that we set boundaries with other people or we attempt to set boundaries with other people before we actually even assess if those people have created the situation that we're setting boundaries for. And what I mean by that is sometimes we create the situation and then we have a hard time setting the boundaries because the boundaries need to be actually set within ourselves. And so when you think about the boundaries that you want to set or that you have set with other people, sometimes you have to sit with yourself and assess yourself to see if you are actually needing to set those boundaries with you because you're the one creating the toxic situation by adding things to the situation that aren't actually there. So, when you think about setting boundaries with a relative or a person in your life, have you actually tried to have the conversation with that person about the way they make you feel and the way you're interpreting their intentions? Because if you haven't had that conversation, then what could be happening is that your interpretation is riddled with your own narrative, is riddled with your own conditioning, is riddled with your own idea of what's happening. And in reality, that person didn't have those intentions in the first place. So I think about the boundaries that I have set and that I have the hardest time setting. And the ones that I've set have come as a result of a pattern of behavior from another person. And the behavior isn't necessarily interpreted as that type of behavior. It just is that type of behavior. But then I think about the boundaries that I have a really hard time setting. And a lot of times it's because those boundaries are ones that I need to set with me and not ones that I need to set with the people around me. So I'm going to take you through the process of this because I feel like it's one that is so important for us to understand when navigating the world, not even just the boundary part, but when navigating the world and feeling overwhelmed and exhausted by the things that are expected of us, because oftentimes we don't really sit in what the expectations are and the origin of those expectations. And I've done several videos before about having expectations, having thought processes, and those things coming from your conditioning and things that you've heard in the past. If you haven't worked through those, then what you're going to oftentimes do is take into your professional role, into any role that you have assigned to you as far as motherhood, daughter, sister, whatever it is. And you're going to take those thoughts from your conditioning into that. And then it's really difficult to set a boundary with yourself that you're no longer going to think, process, and do the things that you've always done, even if someone else hasn't ever placed that expectation onto you. So, a prime example would be my sister has never told me, like, we've never had this conversation. I've never even told her that I oftentimes feel this way, but she's never told me that she feels like I don't reach out to her enough or I don't check on her enough because she was the older sibling. And oftentimes I feel like, people just leave her alone because she had it all together. And I know that nobody has it all together and everybody needs somebody to process their emotions or feelings with. And so oftentimes I'll be like, I know that she has a husband and, people that she can talk to, but I should be checking on her more. And so I hold that in my mind and in my heart. And so there's this process that I go through where it's like, I really need to reach out to her. I really need to see if she's okay. Have I reached out to her enough? And just this overthinking cycle that I go through. And so I don't need to set a boundary with her because the expectation isn't hers, it's mine. So the boundary that I need to set is the one with myself that says, you're placing all of this pressure on yourself to be this, what you idealize as the perfect sister when no one has ever asked you to reach out more, do more, or be more. In fact, when I do reach out to her, I know she's appreciative of it because we have these, conversations where they end well. So it's never been something that she's requested from me. So I have to tell myself, this isn't something that has been expected from you. This isn't something that has created a toxic situation from external. The toxic situation is created internal, and it's because of the narrative that you're telling yourself and the expectations that you've placed on yourself and the level of perfectionism that you try to live up to. And so, because of that, you need to set the boundary with yourself. And so, the first thing you really need to think about is your narrative creating the expectation? So, have you told yourself that people don't think you're doing enough? Have you told yourself that people think that you're stuck up and set in your ways and insert insult here? Have you told yourself that if you don't do all of these things that you've put on the list as an expectation for someone who is in that role, that people are going to think all of these insults that you've built up in your own head? If those things are true, if you've created the narrative and you've created the expectation, then it's not a boundary for that environment, right? It's a boundary for you. Now, if the thoughts that you've had and if the narrative that you create actually come to fruition when you do set the boundaries, then that's a whole nother thing that you need to deal with. But if you leave work on time and get to work on time, and you tell yourself that if you don't stay later or if you don't get there earlier, someone's going to think that you're not working as hard or you're not a leader or whatever it is. If no one ever said that to you, then perhaps you can try leaving work on time and getting to work on time without doing extra hours and making sure that you're prioritizing your work-life balance over what people are going to think of you, and then see what happens. And if the result of that is somebody having something negative to say, then you go set the boundary with the person. But for right now, because you haven't done it and no one has said it to you, and the narrative that's processing is one that you've created in your own brain, right now you need to set the boundary with yourself. And so that looks like, I'm not going to continue this narrative in my brain. As soon as a narrative starts that never existed externally from my brain, I'm going to check that narrative. Is that true? Did someone actually say that? Did someone actually expect that from me? So when you do that, oftentimes that'll cut it off right there because no one has ever said that to you or expected it from you. You've expected it from yourself. And in that instance, you don't have to set a boundary with anybody externally other than your own thought processes. Now, the second thing that happens is that you assign those expectations that you've created to people. So when you create that narrative and you haven't checked the narrative, you just continue to let the narrative roll on through, the script keep on scripting, then now you've assigned that to other people. So you say, okay, well, this person is definitely thinking that. My sister is definitely thinking that I don't check on her enough, so therefore I don't care about her. This expectation is now one that is placed on me from someone else. And because you didn't check the narrative, now you've placed that script, that part of your own internal thinking, you've placed that expectation that was created as a result of it, and you've actually assigned it to a person. And you've said, this person thinks that if I do this, then that means this. And they've never even alluded to it. Even if you've heard that person gossip about other people or say these things about other people, and so that is part of what's perpetuating that narrative for you. They've never said it about you or to you, and you're not responsible for what they say about you behind the scenes. So even if they've said it to other people, if they've not addressed it with you, then you need to check the narrative and you need to make sure that you're not assigning that narrative to other people, because that also creates an instance where other people have to be responsible and mature enough to bring a concern to you before you ever need to set the boundary. So boundaries don't need to be set with them, they need to be set with you. So you need to check at this point yourself. You need to check, why am I placing this expectation onto this other person? And oftentimes it's because we don't want to accept accountability for our own internal chaos. So we can't be like, I'm doing this to myself, because that seems a little bit like taking accountability. So we place that narrative and that script onto someone else so that we have someone else to be accountable for the process of our thoughts. And they didn't create that narrative. Therefore, it's not their responsibility to be boundaries to be set with them based on that narrative. Again, if they want to say those things to you, then you have to give them space to be able to say it on their own without you just predicting what they're thinking and what they're going to say and what their emotions are, even if they've said it behind other people's backs for the same thing. Once you check yourself and you say, did someone actually tell me that they expect this from me? Or am I placing this expectation onto myself because of the narrative that I've created in my head? Then you'll be able to take accountability for yourself, and you'll be able to stop that narrative from perpetuating, and you'll be able to stop viewing that person as somebody who thinks the things that you've assigned to them and the expectations that you've placed on you. You'll be able to take those expectations off of yourself, because you'll be checking yourself. You'll be saying that expectation comes from you. It didn't come from anybody else. You created that story in your head. You made that story that big. You made that situation what you're basically pretending that it is. But now you have to be accountable for the expectations that are there because you've placed them on you, but you've assigned them to someone else, so that it feels like it makes sense. It feels like you have the receipts to back up why you feel the way you feel and why the boundaries need to be set. Those boundaries don't need to be set with anyone but yourself at this point. And the third thing is that perfectionism will tell you that you have to complete all of these expectations because producing has brought you to the place that you are. So if you're a highly functional person, if you're somebody who always does exactly what you're asked or goes above and beyond that ask, if you're somebody who can't just sit and let things be, you have to be in the weeds and trying to find solutions to problems, etc., that's not a bad thing. That's not necessarily a negative attribute. But it's when you place the perfectionism onto those expectations that it becomes toxic. And the reason that we do that to ourselves is because what we've always done has gotten us here. And if we feel that that thing has made us successful and highly productive and has shaped people's perspectives of us, then we feel like if we let go of perfectionism, then we might in fact let go of our high productivity. And we like being highly productive. We just don't like the hell that perfectionism puts us in, because we can't ever rest because we always feel like we have to be producing something. And so when you get to a place where you're like, I've created a narrative. I've placed this narrative onto someone else and assigned those expectations from someone else, even though they never assigned them to me. And now I'm trying to do what I've deemed as their ask perfectly. You'll start to wonder, why do I need to do something perfectly for someone else when they never placed the expectation onto me in the first place? So just doing anything will be more than I was ever asked from this outside person. And that's when you'll really start to understand that a lot of these things have come from you internally. And that level of perfectionism that you place on those expectations requires you to check the origin. Does your conditioning say that if you rest, then you're lazy? Does your conditioning say that in order to be accepted, you must therefore be perfect? Does your conditioning say that to draw breath and take up space, that you need to be high functioning? Does it say that in order to be productive, you have to have high cortisol levels from your anxiety and from your perfectionism and from your internal dialogue in order to be that way? And if it says that, then you also know that all of this is coming from inside of your own mind and inside of your own feeling processes and is producing this result because of it. You overthinking, you feeling like frantic because someone is always wanting you to do something. In reality, you've created that entire situation. No one asked you to do the thing. No one required you to have these expectations. No one ever asked you to do it perfectly because they didn't ever ask it from you in the first place. So if you're in a space today where you feel like you're really ready to set boundaries in your life, the first thing that I would suggest for you to do, and I had to do this for myself quite recently, is to sit with yourself. Sit with yourself and think about the things that you place those perfectionism feelings and thoughts on. And then sit with yourself and figure out why you feel like you have to be perfect at anything, because that's going to be a huge weight off your shoulders when you realize that you're human and you're allowed to do things to the best of your abilities, which never will be perfect because no human is perfect. Then sit with yourself and say, who placed these expectations onto me? Once you figure out the ones that came directly from you, you'll know the places that you need to set boundaries for yourself. And then once you do that, you'll be able to go back to the root of all of this, which is the narrative that's playing in your head. And you'll be able to say, it's not true. Never happened. That's a story that I'm telling myself. Once you get real with all of that, then you can start to set the boundaries with the other people. And I'm not saying this is a linear process, but in order to set boundaries in the right spaces, you have to first know who is doing the thing to you, who is creating the toxic environment, who is making you feel like you need to adhere to all of these expectations and do them in a perfect way. And quite often, you're going to find that the person who's creating that toxic environment is you. So if you're in that space today, I would encourage you to go through that process and really set boundaries with yourself. When you start to create narratives, stop them. You can stop your thinking. I know it feels like you can't, but you can stop your thinking. If you've already thought it and you created those expectations for yourself, stop the expectations. I don't expect this from me because no one has asked this of me. And when you're able to do that, you'll really be able to sit with, I don't have to be perfect at anything because no one requires that of me. So if you're in that space today, I encourage you again to go through that process, but to really give yourself some grace, to really allow yourself to understand what toxic parts of your thinking you need to set boundaries around for yourself so that you don't go down that rabbit hole. Reach out to another person and have this conversation with them. It's much easier to identify those parts. But don't sit in a space where you're constantly on a loop of, I'm not doing enough, I'm not being enough, I'm not fulfilling enough, I'm not producing enough, when no one has ever asked you to produce those things in the first place. Thank you for tuning in. If this message was helpful to you, I would love for you to share on all social media platforms, which is where you can reach me, as well as YouTube. And remember that knowledge gained is beautiful to have for yourself. But if we're really trying to ensure that the people around us are breaking free from the bondage that they're in, it's very helpful to share a message that you know will resonate with them. I appreciate you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you again next week.